Okay, welcome back. Chapter 9. I hope you had a good break. We are going to discuss the part 1, and this is a review. So look at these items before you take the quiz or when you want to see if you've covered everything in this portion. So this is about water. You would never think that there's that much to say about water, but it's actually somewhat complicated. So what we'll do is we'll go over the learning outcomes and we'll talk about the slides that are most important. So in this section, we're going to talk about the functions of water, the control mechanisms of how we regulate water. Our bodies are different hormones and perspiration and thirst. And then we're going to look at different sources of water. So the first slide I think would be the most helpful to try to answer is these 3 questions. Why water is a universal solvent? How does water regulate our body temperature? And what are 2 examples of its role as a lubricant? So looking at those questions, the first one was, why is it considered a universal solvent? This slide answers that question. It's partly because water molecule has a charge, it's a very slight negative and positive charge. Because of that, it can easily mix with other chemicals. It can have a slight bond with a negative, a slight bond with a positive, so it can easily mix with ions and electrolytes and hang on to them very tightly. Also, the shape of it, the fact that it's kind of this V shape, also makes it very easy for things to tuck in around the water molecule so that it can transport soluble nutrients through the blood, in the cells, for different chemical reactions. We produce a lot of water as part of our metabolism, and you can watch this little video if you want to see a little more. This 1 minute talks about these things. So water is an amazing solvent, and it's easy to mix together. Also, so I mentioned again, it's polar, and it can dissolve. It's so small. That's another thing. It can dissolve many things because of its size. And so it transports different vitamins and minerals. So that's why it's a universal solvent. And then the next question was, how does it regulate our body temperature? So how does water regulate our body temperature? And the answer to that would be that water keeps us cool. And how it does that is because water has a high heat capacity, meaning that it can hold heat for a long time. If you think about this picture here, if you drive by in the morning, you see fog. It's because the air temperature often has dropped overnight, but the water has held the temperature longer. So the water is actually warmer than the air and it creates condensation. So water holds heat longer than air does because of the denseness of the molecules. So because of that, it keeps our body stable, our body temperature stable because we are 50 to 70% water. And we need this heat to raise our temperature. We get some extra temperature or extra heat from chemical reactions and our heart rate, our blood flow, but the water is helping to maintain that temperature. Another picture of that is here. So when we sweat to help maintain, if we get too hot, then that's the whole idea of these sweat glands in our skin, so that if the water if we need to release some water because of the heat, so on a very hot day, we often sweat because the extra water can be released and then evaporated, which cools off the surface of our skin. And then the interesting thing about that is the coolness, the water is like a refrigerator. I mean, we're moving this fluid from the hot part of our trunk of our body to the outskirts of our body and the arms and legs, and it can cool off as it makes this run around our body. It can cool off. It can release some of the water through sweat, and then as it warms up around the heart, it goes out again to the arms and relieves some of the sweat and comes back. So that also helps maintain temperature. And the last thing is it's a lubricant. How is it a lubricant? There's a lot of ways that our body has water for lubricant. And one is just around our brain, the cerebrospinal fluid. Why we wear helmets to try to protect that. Also, there's some fluid around our lungs. It's called pleurisy or pleural fluid. It actually protects our lungs from, just gives it some little flexibility. There's fluid around our joints, the synovial fluid. There's fluid in the baby when we are pregnant, the amniotic fluid. There's mucus in our GI so that we can swallow, and saliva, digestive secretion. So many ways that our body has fluid for protection and for movement. So those are some of those questions. The next section, these have these questions. List the components of water intake and water output. What is the AI, or how much water do we need a day? How do the hormones regulate our water? How do we know if thirst is going to help with us, or help give us enough water? And can we get too much water? So this section is talking about the components of water. So here what we'll find is that water is lost through different areas. So we have some in our sweat and our urine. We have some fluid in our just the lungs as we breathe out water. Our air is a bit of water in there, and our feces. And then we get water in our food. We also make water through metabolic reactions as we digest foods. The other place we can see here is as we just drink water, we're getting water from fluids, and we're getting it from our food. And we're losing water through our urine, we're losing water through our skin perspiration, and through our lung respiration and feces. So there's a name for that. This is called sensible water output because we can measure it. It's the urine. This is called insensible water loss because it's just perspiration, respiration, feces. It's very small amounts that are pretty hard to measure. So that's the intake and the output of water. How much water do we need? What is the AI, or the suggested amount for the day? For women, it's about 11 cups. For men, it's about 15 cups. However, we get a lot of food with water in it, so maybe more like 9 cups versus 13 cups. But if you're an athlete, and especially in a hot day, you might drink as much as 42 cups of water. How do hormones balance our water? So we have a very specific way that our body fluids are maintained by hormones, just like every other system we've talked about. So the main thing I circled here was ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And that's one of the main hormones that signals the kidneys to retain more water. So if you're dehydrated, they'll retain sodium, which will hold water, and then you won't lose as much water. So this particular hormone, ADH, is what's going to help maintain our water content. Another picture of that is there's another angiotensin is another product that helps our kidneys is triggered by our kidneys, and aldosterone is another hormone that's actually from a gland, the adrenal gland, which is right next to our kidneys. So these are other receptors and other focuses to help maintain water balance. Here is a picture then of fluid conservation. So the ADH is secreted by the pituitary gland. So when the blood volume gets too low, it tells the kidneys to not reduce as much water, but actually hold on to the water. You can watch that video if you'd like. And aldosterone is produced by the adrenal gland, which is right by the kidney. And that also tells the kidneys to conserve sodium and water, so you won't dehydrate. So those are hormone controls. Another thing is thirst. Can we rely on our thirst to make sure that we get enough water? If we are dehydrating or using up water, so that usually you can feel thirsty once 1 or 2% of your body water has been lost, you'll feel the thirst. But if you haven't drunk, if you just ignore that, if you lose 4%, you'll start getting dizzy and having a headache. And once you've lost 10% of your water content, you're very weak and you actually can have an illness. And if it gets any more than that, you could die. It's heat exhaustion. So this is heat exhaustion. This could be a heat stroke. It's very dangerous. So we try to rely on our thirst, but sometimes our thirst isn't good enough. The strongest thirst, or just a vague discomfort or sense of oppression, loss of appetite, this is what happens if you don't drink right off the bat. It gets worse and worse, and all the way to delirium and muscle cramps and tingling. So you really, we need to try to focus on drinking and keeping hydrated, even if we're not thirsty right at the time. You can tell if you're dehydrated by the color of your urine. So if your urine is somewhat very pale yellow, that means it's pretty good. But the darker it gets, that's the very dangerous dehydration sign. And then intoxication. Can you get too much water? Can we actually be intoxicated by water? Well, it can happen. So overhydration can lead to sodium dilution. So think about it. You have sodium in the water, in your blood and in your water. It helps hold your water. And if you don't have if you have so much water, it's almost like you have too little sodium, so you overhydrate. So this can cause, it's also a fatal condition, just like dehydration. Overhydration can cause what's called hyponatremia. Hypo means low sodium, natremia. So that's the one thing that's very serious about drinking too much too fast. So that is not a good indication of health. The last section then, just to remember, reviewing all this, is the electrolyte balance. So we're talking about osmosis, and we're talking about the four main electrolytes, and then what happens in our cells. So this is another thing that leads to dehydration. It leads to the understanding of our fluids. So we want to understand that osmosis, the first thing, is just the movement of water inside and outside. So you have a membrane, and a lot of times you don't need ATP to transport things because we need it for hormones, we need it for glucose, but we don't need it often for water. Water will just follow sodium or follow the electrolytes. So if there's a lot of electrolytes over here, water is going to move toward the electrolytes to try to dilute them so they're even on both sides of the membrane. So this is what it's trying to always be even, the solute and the solvent. Solvent is the water, and solute are whatever electrolytes are in that. So that's important to understand so we can see how water moves in the cell. So if you just look at one cell and it's just sitting still and there's no movement, there's usually sodium and chloride are on the outside of the cell, and intracellularly is usually this potassium and phosphate. So this is just sitting still. Extracellular is the sodium and chloride. So that's what's happening in the cell. But then if you have movement then, because things change, so you can think about this experiment. If I put this gummy bear in salt water for a week, it gets very small. If I put the salt water or this gummy bear in regular water, or if I put it in tap water, it does different things because this has a lot of sugar in it. So if you put it in a really concentrated salt water, a lot of the water comes out of the gummy bear into the very salty water around it, and it shrinks it because the water's moved out. In this case, the water moved out and in at an even rate. But if you just put it in plain water, the plain water tries to move into the gummy bear because there's no solute around the bear. It's completely empty of solute. So they just move inside the bear and expand it until often it just breaks. So these are just to show examples of how water moves in and out. And there's names for that. They call it hypertonic or hypotonic. So here's an isotonic, hypotonic, hypertonic. So you just have to understand that isotonic is even, the same amount of fluid or electrolytes inside and outside, so it's balanced. That's the gummy bear that didn't really expand, it just stayed the normal size because the water moved in and out at a regular rate. But here you have a hypertonic solution, with like the one with the little teeny gummy bear, because so much solute outside of this gummy bear that all of the water moved out to try to equalize so many things outside the cell. That's this one. It became very tiny. That's called hypertonic. In this case, there was a lot less electrolyte outside or the gummy bear, so it's moving in, and trying to equalize the same amount of electrolytes inside and outside. And that's when you get this really big, large, and that's hypotonic. It's like a hypopotamus. It got big because there was very little solute around the outside. So you might want to try to remember these when you're studying this chapter, those three terms. And that pretty much explains, you can read the rest of the slides, but those are the main concepts of this section of slide. Okay, thank you.